Today I'm going to show you how to cut one continuous yard of fabric into 2.5 inch strips. The first yard of fabric I'm going to cut up, I'm going to use just a regular ruler and my cutting mat. And the second yard of fabric I'm going to cut up using a Creative Grids Stripology ruler. And I don't know if you've seen one of these before, but they are a total game changer. They're kind of a splurge item, but they save a ton of time. So let's get to it. First thing you do is you got to press it smooth. It makes a world of difference. And then when you do that, if you notice that your selvages, sometimes they're very even with each other and sometimes one will be slanting down. If they are, iron out this crease first and reset yourself straight. After I make sure that my selvages line up and that there's no twisting along this fold right here, is I'm gonna fold this up very straight with my selvage. So I want this fold line to be even with my selvage. I don't cover up the selvage, but I run it just kind of right along that edge. Now you're gonna line the top of your selvage up with the line on your mat. So I'm cutting this one with my ruler and I'm gonna be using lines on my mat. Then I'm going to square off the edge on the right. So you wanna make sure that when you go to square it off, all 4 of your fabric edges are covering that line because the fabric isn't always cut square. And I know there's a lot of talk about not using the lines on your mat. I use the lines on my mat. I've always used an Olfa and I've never had problems because when I take a ruler and I line it up with the lines on my cutting mat, the lines on my ruler are exactly the same as my mat. So I know my mat is still accurate. I'm gonna square this up along the 0 basically line, the first line, and now you're ready to start cutting. The best way to see where your lines need to go is not by trying to line up the edge with a line, but it's trying to line up with one of the lines on your ruler that's covering a line on your mat. So for this instance, I'm gonna look at the half mark, which I flip this around. That shows me the half mark right there. I'm gonna make sure that is covering one of the marks on here since we're doing 2.5. So it's 1, 2.5. And I'm making sure that this black line right here is covering that yellow line right there. And then you also wanna make sure and do the same thing at the top. So do you see how those lines need to come over just a little bit to be a little bit more accurate? I'm gonna count over 2.5. So I go 1, 2.5, and then I always double count back, 1/2, 1, 2, and then I know I'm accurate. Cut forward, never cut back. And I've got 1. Now, since I'm at 1/2 inch before this line, I'm gonna count 1/2, 1, 2. And now when you go to make sure your ruler is lined up, look at the 1 inch line here and make sure it's covering the 1 inch line there. So can you see how when I cover that yellow line, it's perfect at the top? And you wanna make sure that is also covering that yellow line. Cut forward. And then I usually just make sure that it's free. And then when I have a little leftover strip, I just like to square it off at whatever size it is, and then I use it later in a string quilt. Now to cut our yard of fabric using the Stripology ruler, I'm actually gonna start from the left and I'm gonna cut right. I'm gonna make sure that my selvages are even the whole way down and that there's not any twisting along this fold. Line up the fold of my fabric along the selvage line, and I'm just gonna make sure that the whole way down it remains consistent and it's lined up the same the whole way down. Once you have your fabric folded, you're gonna take the raw edge of your fabric and you're gonna line it up so that you can square it off with the outside line, the very outside line on your cutting mat. But when you do that, first you take a line on your mat. I'm gonna pick the 16 and I'm just gonna make sure that my selvage is lined up with that the whole way down. Make sure that all 4 layers of your fabric are covering that outside line so that you can trim it off nice and square. On your cutting mat, for every 2.5 inches, you'll see here, for every 2.5 inch cut, there's gonna be a square. So you're gonna trim and you're gonna square up at the 0, and then your first cut, you're gonna look for the square and you're gonna cut down that line. So lay your ruler on your mat. And to make sure that my ruler is straight, I'm gonna take this white line and I'm gonna put it over the yellow line on my cutting mat. So I'm gonna make sure this is straight the whole way down, as well as I need to have the first line going vertical. So I have my white line covering that yellow line on my cutting mat the whole way down. I know that it's straight horizontally, and then I make sure that this line is covering the yellow cutting line on my mat at the top, as well as at the bottom. And you can see these lines here are covering my mat. And so it's gonna stay squared up as you make your first 8 cuts, and then we'll pick up the ruler and set it down again. To square this up, you could flip around and you could cut it this way. I'm just gonna do it from this side, and I'm gonna go very, very careful. So I'm gonna look at these squares just to make my next cuts. So my first cut is gonna be at the 2.5. There's a little half right there. I'm gonna put my rotary cutter in, and I'm gonna cut all the way through. I'm gonna look at the next square, which is at the 5. So you can double check yourself, but just, I always look for my squares, and you stick it in there and push forward. Okay, I'm gonna lift up my ruler. I'm gonna gently set it down. I'm just gonna pick up the strips of fabric that I've cut so far. If you're struggling with these not cutting all the way through, put a new blade on. Having a new sharp blade is essential. Okay, so now I'm just gonna re-line up my ruler just like I did before. I'm gonna have one of the white lines cover the yellow line on here, and I'm gonna make sure I have that first cutting line at the edge of my fabric. So I first line up that line. I make sure the white line is gonna be square the whole way down. Then I double check the bottom to make sure these black lines are also covering the yellow line. And now you have one nice yard. And there you have it. It's so fast and quick to cut 1 yard into 2.5 strips. Cut them for your swap, and you'll be ready to send them in.